It's crazy. We're beginning to see the beginnings of the coping and seething from game journalists. What was supposed to be a minor, inconsequential game in the 2025 release schedule is slated to become game of the year. That's right. Donkey Kong Bonanza fans are on the warpath. We're clowning on Clear Obscure fans. We're clowning on Death Stranding 2 fans. We're clowning on anybody who tries to talk down about this game, whether they be Darkside Phil or Jeff Keighley himself. Everyone who tries to downplay Donkey Kong Bonanza is just sprinting a marathon on made of banana peels, on a road made of banana peels, right? They're just slipping, they're falling, they're not getting anywhere. And then meanwhile, you have DK just sitting there eating bananas and throwing more peels onto the pavement. That is the current situation we're in. Bonanza is a huge, phenomenal success, and the online gaming community can't bring itself to admit it, because that would mean acknowledging that Death Stranding 2 failed, acknowledging that Clear Obscure Expedition, 1 failed. You have to face facts. Games like Monster Hunter Wilds are wildly hated in Japan and among PC gamers for a wide range of reasons. And meanwhile, Nintendo fans are sitting here talking about how great Bonanza is. Everybody is extremely happy with Bonanza, except those in the community who desperately want Nintendo to fail. Stuttering Craig keeps doing this, well, Bonanza isn't what I expected. Nobody cares. You don't play games, Craig. So, it's really interesting to see this happen, because this, to me, is a really good example of game journalist bias against Nintendo, where they always give second string Nintendo IPs like Donkey Kong, Fire Emblem, Kirby, middling scores in the mid 80s, while, giving absolute slop like Death Stranding and Red Dead Redemption 2 perfect 10 out of 10s. Bonanza is better than Astrobot in every way, shape, and form, but good luck getting the gaming journalism industry to admit it. After putting so much money and time and trying to shill Astrobot as one of the best games of last year, there is a very suspicious silence among the game journalism community as to which of the two 3D platformers is better. Because if you directly compare them, it's really not even a contest. Donkey Kong is a better homage to Nintendo's long history with the genre, with the series as a whole, with its franchise, with Mario, Pauline, and the franchise's roots, right? It innovated with the combat mechanics and the digging and just everything you can do in the game, and it's considerably longer. Donkey Kong Bonanza is going to take 40 hours to get everything in, probably. Astrobot takes 10. The difference in quality between the two titles is just palpable. It's insane. But you aren't really seeing the industry acknowledge that, because that flies in the face of the narrative. Acknowledging that Donkey Kong Bonanza is such a huge, roaring success and that everybody is in love with it would be acknowledging that Nintendo fans care about games other than Mario and Zelda. And this is a pervasive problem with the gaming industry. You see this all the time, is that they'll give Mario and Zelda titles perfect scores and then use those perfect scores to downplay every single other Nintendo game that comes out. Whether they're Tropical Freeze, or Kid Icarus Uprising, or Kirby and the Forgotten Land, No More Heroes 3, Bayonetta 3, Metroid Dread, Samus Returns, Ever Oasis, Codename Steam. The list goes on and on and on and on, right? The narrative has always been that you only buy a Nintendo console for Mario and Zelda, but the far superior third-party games are right there on Xbox and PlayStation, and you should probably expect those to be the dominant platforms going forward, right? That's always been the narrative, right? But what's happened, especially over the past 15 years, is that more and more people are starting to discover Nintendo's wider catalog of games. Series that the game journalism industry at large has desperately tried to downplay over the years. When Kirby's a really good example. Kirby Air Ride was this wildly hated title on Nintendo GameCube. Everyone said it failed. Everyone hated it. It became a bit of a cult classic among hardcore fans, but Kirby like languished in obscurity for years until like Return to Dreamland came out in 2012 on Wii, which kicked off like his renaissance, which kicked off like Triple Deluxe and Planet Robobot and like all this stuff, making leading up to Forgotten Land, which is one of the best games on Switch and one of the best Kirby game ever made, right? We went through like a 20-year period of people acting like Kirby wasn't a relevant Nintendo character, that it wasn't worth talking about, that the games were too easy to care about. And meanwhile, in the background, the developers were building up something special, something that like just would eventually become absolute peak. And we got lots of really good games along the way. Like Donkey Kong kind of went through a similar arc, right? Where Returns was this huge, monumental success story, completely downplayed. Even though that like when Jungle Beat came out, the narrative was that it wasn't enough like Country. Tropical Freeze was widely detested and hated at the time. That's a cult classic now. And now with Bonanza, game journals have like reached the point where like they can no longer control the narrative. This game that's not a Mario or a Zelda game is selling people on Switch 2s, and that's very scary to them. Donkey Kong is one of those brands that they've been trying to destroy since the 90s. Donkey Kong 64. The reason why it has a reputation for killing the 3D collectathon genre, even though that we had several titles. Sunshine came out after that. Galaxy came after that. Odyssey followed up on that, and Bonanza followed up on this. Like, it was always just a game journal cope to downplay one of the biggest, most ambitious games on N64. Donkey Kong 64, which is way far superior to something like Conker's Bad Fur Day, by the way. Donkey Kong 64 was this game that was aggressively attacked and derided by game journals to try and push their pro PlayStation agenda. And the end result of that was this. They succeeded with downplaying Donkey Kong 64, where people hated that game for decades. And they, Rareware sold themselves to Microsoft. Like Nintendo's, they thought Nintendo was doomed. And this is the end result. Donkey Kong's back, and in a lot of ways, bigger than ever. Like, I would not be surprised if Bonanza does outperform like the original Donkey Kong Country, like becomes the best-selling title in the series. And it's something that you are going to see these people cope and seethe about a lot. I do think that's my big takeaway. Looking at this, looking at this situation, seeing what like the establishment is doing, because they are very very scared about the implications of this, because they gave Astrobot Game of the Year. Astrobot was supposed to be the big 3D platformer of the generation. The entire cope and narrative was that like only Mario was bigger and more popular than it, and the implication was that like that was only because Mario was a more like established brand. And now DK comes back after such a long hiatus and just completely stomps it without even really trying. And you just know that the shills at Sony are seething right now. You just know the influencers are already trying to coke up their next concoction of just nonsense. But like it really needs to be said that like the Nintendo Switch 2 is a roaring success, and the gaming community is not happy about it in the slightest.